a young man born on the small island of Corsica, would become one of the most feared and revered names in European history. From a low-ranking officer, the Emperor of France, his journey redrew maps, toppled empires, and challenged the balance of power across the continent. Napoleon Bonaparte didn't just command armies, he shaped an entire era. In this documentary, you'll follow every step of his French general, from his childhood to his final days in St. Helena. From the Coup of 18 Brumaire to the Battle of Waterloo, from the Napoleonic Code to his coronation, this is the complete history of one of the most decisive figures in modern times. And it all begins long before the Napoleonic Wars. In the second half of the 18th century, France was facing an economic, political, and social crisis that would culminate in the French Revolution. Amid the chaos, a bold and strategic military figure emerged, Napoleon Bonaparte. Born on the island of Corsica, he came of age as his country underwent radical transformation. The Revolutionary Wars paved the way for his meteoric rise in the French army. His name would soon become synonymous with order in times of instability. This is the journey of a man who rose from the empire's margins to shape the fate of all Europe. Birth and youth in Corsica. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, in the city of Ajaccio on the island of Corsica, just 1 year after the territory had been annexed by France. Of Italian descent, his family belonged to the local nobility, although they lived with modest means. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer and served as the island's representative in Paris. His mother, Letizia Romolino, played a crucial role in shaping Napoleon's strict and disciplined upbringing. He was the second of 8 children. From an early age, he showed a strong personality, reserved behavior, and quiet ambition. As a child, he witnessed tensions between Corsicans and newly arrived French authorities. This environment deeply influenced his political vision and desire for recognition. At the age of 9, Napoleon was sent to mainland France, where he enrolled at the military school of Brienne-le-Château. There, he faced prejudice due to his Corsican accent and limited command of the French language. Despite social isolation, he quickly stood out in mathematics, history, and military sciences. His performance caught the attention of instructors who recognized his exceptional strategic talent. At the same time, he developed a strong interest in reading, especially biographies of leaders such as Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. These literary influences shaped his vision of leadership and conquest. Among aristocratic classmates, his provincial background and reserved nature kept him isolated, but that only sharpened his focus. Already at that stage, the profile of a future French general was emerging. In 1784, he was accepted into the École Militaire in Paris, where he completed his military studies in record time. He became the first Corsican to graduate as an artillery officer in the elite French military. His first post as a lieutenant came in 1785 in the Lafayette Regiment. The early death of his father that same year disrupted the family structure, forcing Napoleon to take on responsibilities at a young age. He sent part of his salary to support his mother and siblings, always remaining close to his family. At this stage, he was still an unknown young officer, but his ambitions were far greater. His solid artillery training would later provide him with a decisive technical edge in future wars. His discipline and organization were evident in his reports and conduct. The name Napoleon Bonaparte began to circulate discreetly in military circles. With the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789, Napoleon saw a chance to rise. The collapse of the monarchy and the traditional power structures created space for new talent, even those of humble origins. Initially, he returned to Corsica and tried to engage in local politics alongside Pasquale Paoli, the leader of the Corsican resistance. However, they soon clashed, leading Napoleon to break with the regionalist cause and align fully with revolutionary France. In 1793, he fled with his family to Marseille after being declared an enemy by Paoli. This break marked the end of his Corsican identity and the beginning of his full embrace of French nationality. From then on, he dedicated himself entirely to his military career within the revolutionary context of France. Later, in 1793, he was assigned to the siege of Toulon, a city occupied by royalists supported by the British fleet. Napoleon devised a strategic attack plan that caught the attention of his superiors. His decisive role in the victory earned him a promotion to brigadier general at the age of 24. This was the turning point in his career. The once unknown Corsican now gained visibility as a promising French general. His name began circulating in Parisian salons, and his reports were praised by members of the Committee of Public Safety. This rapid rise was made possible by the instability of the period, but also by his tactical intelligence and battlefield initiative. For the first time, Napoleon Bonaparte had truly stepped onto the stage of history. In the following years, he became involved with political circles connected to the Jacobins, particularly Augustin Robespierre, the brother of Maximilien Robespierre. This connection benefited him briefly, but became dangerous after the fall of the Jacobins in 1794. Napoleon was arrested under suspicion of supporting the deposed regime, but was released shortly thereafter. Even so, he was temporarily removed from the army and lived in Paris without clear prospects. During this time, he deepened his tactical studies and maintained strategic contacts with political figures in the Directory. This forced pause would prove to be only temporary. The post-revolutionary context demanded pragmatic leaders, and Napoleon was one of the emerging figures. Gradually, the French Revolution became the perfect stage for Napoleon's rise to power. The young Corsican officer, once mocked for his accent, now commanded troops and made decisions that would shape the fate of nations. The name Napoleon Bonaparte was beginning to make a real impact on post-revolutionary France. French Revolution and the beginning of his military career. After his success in Toulon and promotion to brigadier general, Napoleon Bonaparte established himself as a rising name within the Republican Army. The year was 1794, and France was still reeling from the effects of the French Revolution, facing internal instability and political chaos. The Committee of Public Safety had lost power after the fall of Robespierre, opening the way for the Directory to take control. Despite his brief prior arrest, Napoleon managed to maintain influence with key figures in the new government. He moved through Paris with growing prestige, although he had no active military command at that moment. He was visible, but still waiting for the right opportunity to emerge. That opportunity came in 1795 during a royalist uprising in Paris. When monarchist forces attempted to take the city, the Directory turned to Napoleon to restore order. He led a swift and decisive operation, positioning cannons in key streets and ordering direct fire on the insurgents. The action, though violent, halted the attack and stabilized the capital. This event, known as the 13 Vendémiaires, solidified his image as a defender of the revolutionary government. His success in crushing the revolt earned him the post of commander of the Army of the Interior. From that moment, Napoleon was no longer just a promising officer. He became essential to France's military leadership. It was around this time that he met Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow from the aristocracy who moved among revolutionary elites. They married in March 1796, just shortly before Napoleon took command of the Army of Italy. Despite their differences in background and lifestyle, Josephine would become a central figure in his political and personal life. Backed by the Directory and gaining rapid prestige, Bonaparte left for Italy with orders to push back Austrian forces and their allies. But when he arrived, he defied expectations. He transformed the poorly supplied and disorganized army into a disciplined and aggressive force. This marked the emergence of the military strategist who would come to dominate the battlefields of Europe. The Italian campaign, launched in 1796, was Napoleon's first major test as commander of a frontline army. In a matter of months, he repeatedly defeated Austrian forces, forcing retreats and capturing key cities such as Lodi, Arcole, and Rivoli. His swift maneuvers, bold tactics, and effective use of artillery stunned his opponents. These victories secured French control in northern Italy and introduced a new model of warfare. Beyond military success, Napoleon showed political skill, imposing treaties, reshaping local republics, and expanding French influence. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to power began to take shape, though unofficially. This was the beginning of his role not just as a general, but as a builder of empire. During the campaign, he sent regular reports to the Directory detailing his victories, which helped shape his public image. The press, partly influenced by allies, began to celebrate every move. The name Napoleon Bonaparte became a symbol of strength, renewal, and military glory. At the same time, tensions began to rise with other generals and politicians who feared his growing popularity. The French Revolution, which had toppled kings and opened the door to new leadership, now saw one general dominating both battlefields and public opinion. His career was no longer just military. It took on unmistakable political dimensions. The French Empire had not yet been declared, but its future emperor was already taking his first steps. After the Italian campaign ended, Napoleon returned to France in 1797 as a national hero. He had defeated the Austrians, redrawn borders, and spread revolutionary ideals on his own terms. However, members of the Directory grew wary of him. Young, charismatic, popular, and ambitious, he posed a potential threat to the fragile republic. To distance himself from Paris, they assigned him a new mission: to invade Egypt. The aim was to disrupt British trade routes to India and weaken the British Empire. Though risky, the expedition appealed to Napoleon as it promised more power and greater prestige. He accepted the task, launching one of the most unique campaigns of his career. In 1798, he departed for Egypt with more than 30,000 soldiers, scientists, engineers, and scholars, a modern army with both military and scientific goals. The campaign began with victory at the Battle of the Pyramids, but complications soon followed. The French fleet was destroyed by the British at the Battle of the Nile, severing communication with France. Nevertheless, Napoleon maintained command and pushed on with operations in the Middle East. The French Revolution remained the backdrop, but now the name dominating European headlines was his. The French general was no longer just winning battles. He was becoming the central figure in the story of late 18th century Europe. Coup of 18 Brumaire and rise to power. In 1799, after the troubled Egyptian campaign, Napoleon Bonaparte decided to return to France, even without official permission. The political situation was unstable. The Directory faced economic crisis, loss of public support, and growing internal divisions. Upon landing in Toulon, Napoleon was welcomed as a hero, despite the setbacks in Egypt. His military prestige, earned in earlier campaigns, remained untouched. In Paris, he found the fragmented political landscape, where various factions competed for control. This environment presented an opportunity for decisive action. Napoleon quickly realized that power in France was vulnerable, and he intended to seize it. Through discreet alliances with key political figures like Emmanuel Sieyès and Roger Ducac, Bonaparte orchestrated a plan to dismantle the Directory. The goal was to establish a stronger, more centralized government under the pretext of protecting the values of the French Revolution. The plan was set in motion on November 9, 1799, the 18th of Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar.
Troops loyal to Napoleon occupied strategic points across Paris, and the Directory's leaders were pressured to resign. Some resisted, but were quickly neutralized. The operation was executed with military precision. By the following day, the Directory was officially dissolved. The path to power had opened. Opposition attempted to fight back in the Council of 500, but Napoleon's troops intervened directly. Bonaparte entered the chamber himself and was met with intense protest. Visibly shaken at first, he regained control with the help of his brother Lucien Bonaparte, who presided over the session and declared the assembly under threat. Troops then forcibly dispersed the lawmakers. The coup was complete. Shortly after, a new constitution was drafted, establishing the consulate. 3 consuls were appointed to govern France, with Napoleon as the first consul. In practice, he held the real power. The transition was presented to the public as a necessary measure to restore order and preserve revolutionary ideals. As first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte took control of the French state. He reformed institutions, reorganized the legal system, and resumed command of the army. His government gained strong popular support, especially among the peasants, the bourgeoisie, and the military. The ongoing instability and political fatigue played in his favor. He regained control over rebellious regions and initiated peace negotiations with foreign enemies. Simultaneously, he concentrated executive power, weakening the influence of the other consuls. The Napoleonic Code began to take shape, aiming to unify French law and reinforce principles like property rights and civil equality. The new regime was taking form. In 1800, Napoleon led a military campaign in Italy to counter Austrian advances. His army's crossing of the Alps became an iconic image of determination and boldness. At the Battle of Marengo, he secured a decisive victory that cemented his authority in government. The military success further boosted his popularity. On the domestic front, he launched administrative reforms, established the Bank of France, and strengthened the national education system. The French Empire had not yet been proclaimed, but its structure was already under construction. The centralization of power around Napoleon progressed silently and effectively. He no longer governed merely as a general, but as head of state. Over the next 2 years, Napoleon expanded his influence with tighter social controls and repression of dissent. The political police grew stronger, and press censorship intensified. In 1802, a public plebiscite approved the extension of his term as consul for life. Popular support served as a legitimizing force for his continued rule. Though the government remained collegial on paper, all decisions flowed directly through Napoleon. His speeches took on a more authoritative tone, and symbols of command became part of his public image. The figure of the French general rapidly evolved into that of an absolute leader. The stage was set for the next transformation. Behind closed doors, discussions began on reintroducing monarchy, but in a new form. Initially resistant to the idea of a throne, Napoleon started to see coronation as a way to ensure political stability and prevent future conspiracies. In parallel, he laid the foundation for a modern French empire, with efficient administration, unified laws, and a military elite fully subordinate to central authority. The coup of 18 Brumaire, which began as a response to the instability of the French Revolution, had become the foundation of a new regime. General Bonaparte was no longer merely the savior of France. He was now the architect of a new state, and his next steps would show the world how far he was willing to go.
Napoleon's coronation and the Napoleonic Code. In 1804, the political transformation of France reached its peak. After consolidating his position as first consul for life, Napoleon Bonaparte took a definitive step, becoming Emperor of France. The proposal was submitted to a new plebiscite, and the majority of the population approved the change. On December 2nd of that year, The coronation ceremony took place at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. The event was rich in symbolism and marked a break from traditional monarchies. Napoleon crowned himself, taking the crown from the hands of Pope Pius VII. The gesture, meticulously planned, reinforced the message that his authority came not from the church, but from himself and the will of the French people. The coronation unfolded with theatrical grandeur. Attendees included members of the military elite, civil administrators, foreign diplomats, and other high-ranking figures. Josephine was also crowned as empress during the ceremony. The new title not only solidified Napoleon's absolute political control, but also officially marked the beginning of the French Empire. This phase of government retained some revolutionary institutions, but was structured under a highly centralized model. The empire was built on military, administrative, and legal foundations that Bonaparte had been establishing since the coup of 18 Brumaire. The image of the French general now took on imperial contours, uniting authority, glory, and complete control of the state. While building his public image as emperor, Napoleon accelerated the drafting of a new legal code for the country. The Napoleonic Code, also known as the French Civil Code, was enacted in 1804, the same year as the coronation. Its purpose was to unify the country's laws, which had varied from region to region. The new code established principles such as civil equality, property rights, and the secular nature of the state, consolidating many ideals inherited from the French Revolution. However, it also reinforced paternal authority and limited women's rights in line with the era's prevailing views. The legal framework had a profound impact not only in France, but in many European and Latin American countries for decades to come. The creation of the Napoleonic Code involved jurists, administrators, and close advisors to the emperor. The final text was organized in a clear and accessible way, facilitating its application across French territory. The streamlining of justice and the standardization of legal procedures strengthened the empire's administration. Napoleon personally followed the drafting process, showing direct involvement in shaping the code. He viewed it as an essential tool for consolidating his regime and exporting the French model abroad. This legal framework would naturally spread as the French Empire expanded. Civil law, combined with military force, formed the backbone of imperial authority. While building his public image as emperor, Napoleon implemented broader state organization. He created a structured public education system under government supervision. He reinforced the bureaucracy, appointed loyal prefects throughout the country, and empowered administrative councils. The Bank of France, established earlier, began operating as a central institution for currency control and state financing. Each initiative reinforced the regime's efficiency and centralization. Meanwhile, official propaganda celebrated the emperor as a restorer of order and promoter of national prosperity. The building of the French Empire extended beyond warfare. It was a carefully planned political and administrative architecture. Napoleon also initiated the creation of an imperial nobility based on merit and loyalty, contrasting with the hereditary nobility of the ancient regime. Generals, ministers, and administrators received titles such as count, duke, or prince, often accompanied by land or pensions. This new aristocracy reinforced central power, rewarded state service, and helped shape the empire's internal hierarchy. Though some republican facades remained, Napoleon's government increasingly resembled a monarchy. Press control, imperial symbols, and suppression of dissent solidified this transition. The Emperor of France now ruled a state apparatus shaped in his image. While consolidating power at home, Napoleon kept his focus on Europe. His administrative and legal reforms were admired in some countries and viewed with suspicion in others. The centralized and efficient model contrasted with traditional regimes still prevailing across the continent. Simultaneously, the French Empire gained economic and diplomatic weight, challenging the European balance of power. Alliances among European powers began to reorganize quietly. Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer just a revolutionary hero or victorious general. He was now emperor, and his authority extended over battlefields, courtrooms, schools, and ministries. The next chapter would reveal just how far that power could reach.
Expansion of the empire and European alliances. Between 1805 and 1809, the French Empire reached its greatest territorial extent under the command of Napoleon Bonaparte. After consolidating his power as Emperor of France, he intensified military campaigns against the continent's major powers, such as the Austrian Empire, Prussia, and Russia. The most emblematic victory of this period was the Battle of Austerlitz in December 1805, where he brilliantly defeated the Austrian and Russian armies. Known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, the clash forced Austria to sign the Treaty of Pressburg, ceding territories and accepting French terms. This strengthened Napoleon's military prestige and solidified the French Empire as the dominant force in Europe. Soon after, Napoleon promoted a geopolitical reorganization. In 1806, he dissolved the Holy Roman Empire and established the Confederation of the Rhine, a union of German states aligned with France. This shift weakened Habsburg influence and placed much of Germany under indirect control from Paris. That same year, he defeated Prussia at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt, delivering another humiliating blow to a traditional European power. The treaties that followed imposed harsh conditions on the defeated and confirmed Napoleonic supremacy. His military strategy combined battlefield strength with political restructuring, imposing the framework of the French Empire over the conquered regions. Beyond warfare, Napoleon used marriage as a diplomatic tool. In 1809, he divorced Josephine due to her inability to produce an heir and married Marie-Louise, daughter of Austrian Emperor Francis I. The union temporarily sealed peace with Austria and linked Napoleon to Europe's old royal houses. In 1811, the couple had a son, Napoleon II, titled King of Rome. This ensured not only the regime's present, but also its dynastic future. The coronation of Napoleon, which had already broken with traditional monarchical norms, now found legitimacy through bloodline. The foundation of the empire gained institutional stability through the establishment of a successor. To secure control over key European regions, Napoleon appointed his brothers and trusted generals as monarchs of allied states. Joseph Bonaparte became king of Naples and later of Spain. Louis Bonaparte was made king of Holland. Jerome Bonaparte ruled over Westphalia. Other allies assumed thrones in Bavaria, Saxony, and other areas. These governments followed direct instructions from Paris, implemented the Napoleonic Code, reorganized their armies, and integrated their economies into the French system. It was the extension of the empire through a network of familial and administrative domination. The centralization of power around Napoleon Bonaparte created a new European order based on obedience and institutional efficiency. At sea, Britain remained the main obstacle to Napoleonic hegemony. To economically weaken the British, Napoleon established the Continental Blockade in 1806, prohibiting all allied or occupied countries from trading with the British. The measure aimed to strangle the UK's economy and force surrender through isolation. However, enforcement proved difficult. Many nations resisted, smuggling flourished, and local economies suffered. The blockade's limited effectiveness led to internal tensions and strained alliances. Still, the Continental Blockade showed that Napoleon's military strategy extended into economic warfare. He fought not only with weapons, but with policies designed to dominate Europe on every front. During this period, the Napoleonic Wars escalated to an unprecedented scale.
These conflicts involved hundreds of thousands of soldiers, vast logistical operations, and decisions that reshaped the continent. Campaigns were not merely military, they were deeply connected to political and territorial restructuring. Napoleon personally commanded his troops, directing maneuvers with mathematical precision. His strategies were studied in military academies and copied by foreign commanders. The Emperor of France commanded both respect and fear. No European monarch felt safe. All knew that another French campaign could once again alter their nation's fate. By 1809, after another war with Austria and victory at the Battle of Wagram, the empire reached its peak. France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, much of Germany, Poland, Spain, Naples, and other territories were under French control, either directly or through satellite states. The empire appeared unshakable. Napoleon Bonaparte ruled one of the largest domains in modern history, supported by military victories, legal imposition, and diplomatic manipulation. Yet the greater the reach, the harder it became to maintain order. The seeds of resistance, fatigue, and collapse were already being sown, though invisible to most. Napoleon's fall had not yet begun, but the zenith of his power was already signaling the limits of his empire.
The Russian campaign and the beginning of the Fool. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte launched what would become the most disastrous campaign of his career, the invasion of Russia. The official reason was Tsar Alexander I's violation of the Continental Blockade by resuming trade with the British. But political and strategic motives were also at play. Napoleon wanted to reaffirm his domination and eliminate any challenge to the supremacy of the French Empire. To do so, he assembled the largest army in European history to that point, the Grande Armée, with over 600,000 soldiers from across the continent. His plan was to march swiftly to Moscow, force a treaty, and secure total control of Europe. The march began in June 1812. The Grande Armée crossed the Neman River and entered Russian territory with absolute confidence. From the start, however, the army faced major logistical problems. The distances were vast, the roads in poor condition, and supplies insufficient. The Russian army adopted a scorched earth strategy, retreating gradually while destroying farms, wells, and villages. Their aim was to exhaust the French without direct confrontation. Napoleon, growing impatient, pressed forward. The first significant losses came not from battle, but from starvation, disease, and desertion. The weather, initially hot, worsened the conditions. The French Empire began to feel the weight of its own ambition. By September, after 3 months of marching, Napoleon reached Moscow, but the city had been evacuated and set ablaze by the Russians themselves. The fires destroyed the resources the French had hoped to use for survival. With no supplies and no answer from the Tsar to his peace offers, Napoleon remained in Moscow for weeks, waiting for a treaty that never came. As winter approached, the Grande Armée's logistical structure collapsed. What began as a quest for domination turned into a trap. The French general, accustomed to victory, now watched as his army deteriorated day after day. In late October, Napoleon ordered the retreat. The return march became a tragedy. The brutal Russian winter struck, and extreme temperatures, hunger, and attacks from guerrillas and Cossacks devastated the army. Horses froze, soldiers abandoned their weapons, and died by the roadside. Few battles matched the horror of this retreat. Of more than 600,000 men who had crossed into Russia, fewer than 100,000 returned. The moral impact was catastrophic. Napoleon's fall from power was no longer a distant threat. It had become a real possibility. For the first time, his absolute authority was seriously questioned. News of the defeat spread quickly across Europe. Nations under Napoleon's control or influence saw a chance to break free. The Sixth Coalition, formed by Russia, Prussia, Austria, the United Kingdom, Sweden, and others, began organizing to confront Napoleon. The balance of power had shifted. The cracks in the imperial structure, once masked by continuous victories, were now fully exposed.
Blind faith in Napoleon's military genius started to fade. At the same time, he had to urgently rebuild an army to repel enemy advances into European territory. The empire still stood, but its foundations were crumbling. Even after disaster, Napoleon showed resilience. He returned to Paris, restructured the government, and began recruiting new troops. But the army was no longer the same. Lacking experienced veterans, the new soldiers were poorly trained and less effective in combat. Public support also began to erode. Continuous mobilization, war expenses, and successive defeats sparked growing dissatisfaction. The once flawless military strategy now seemed reckless and unsustainable. Napoleon Bonaparte remained Emperor of France, but his hold on power was weakening. The era of expansion had ended. The beginning of the fall was undeniable. The failure of the Russian campaign was not just a military defeat. It shattered the very structure Napoleon had built. His model of rule, rooted in force and administrative control, began to collapse. The image of the once invincible French general suffered irreversible damage. The Russian winter had not only destroyed an army, it had destroyed the myth of imperial invulnerability. The French Empire, once seen as solid and eternal, now showed signs of disintegration. And when European alliances regrouping, the battles ahead would not be for expansion, they would be for survival. History was about to turn, and Napoleon would soon fight not for Europe, but to remain on the throne.
Defeat and exile to Elba. After the collapse of the Russian campaign, Napoleon Bonaparte faced the Europe united against him. The Sixth Coalition, formed by the United Kingdom, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and others, saw France's vulnerability as the perfect chance to bring down the Emperor of France once and for all. Napoleon tried to resist, rebuilding his army and marching to meet the enemy, but the quality of his troops was no longer the same. Defeats piled up across multiple fronts. In 1813, at the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of the Nations, he suffered one of the worst defeats of his military career. From that point, France was under invasion on all sides. In early 1814, coalition armies crossed the Rhine and advanced into French territory. Napoleon still managed to win a few battles on home soil, showing that his military strategy remained sharp. However, French resources were exhausted, and his army was vastly outnumbered. The European alliances held firm, and the fall of Paris became inevitable. While Napoleon fought in the countryside, the Allied forces advanced toward the capital. On March 31, 1814, Paris fell. The city's surrender marked the effective end of French resistance. The political center of the French Empire was lost. With Paris occupied, pressure mounted on the French Senate. The political elite, weary of endless wars and fearing Allied retaliation, took action. On April 2, the Senate declared Napoleon deposed. He tried to resist the decision, but realized he had lost support from the government, from the people, and even from some of his generals. On April 6, 1814, he abdicated the throne in favor of his son, Napoleon II. The Allies, however, rejected the proposal and demanded his complete withdrawal. A few days later, he signed an unconditional abdication. For the first time since the coup of 18 Brumaire, Napoleon no longer ruled France. The Treaty of Fontainebleau, signed on April 11, 1814, set the terms of his departure. Napoleon would be exiled to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean Sea, where he would retain the title of sovereign and command a small personal guard. He was also granted a yearly pension and immunity from prosecution. Elba was chosen strategically, a small island near the Italian coast with limited political influence. The exile was meant to neutralize him, without turning him into a martyr. Even in defeat, Napoleon still struck fear into the hearts of Europe's leaders. His removal was carefully planned. On April 20, 1814,
Napoleon bid farewell to his soldiers in a famous scene at the courtyard of Fontainebleau. Mounted on horseback, visibly emotional, he gave his final speech as Emperor of France. Many soldiers wept. The moment became a lasting symbol at the end of an era. Then he departed under escort toward the port, where he boarded his ship to Elba. During the journey, he faced assassination attempts and public insults. The man who had once been feared by kings and generals was now reduced to a shadow of his former self. Yet he remained composed and silent. Defeat had not erased his presence. As Napoleon sailed into exile, Europe moved to restore order. The Bourbon monarchy returned to the French throne with the coronation of Louis XVIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI. A moderate constitutional monarchy was installed. Meanwhile, the Congress of Vienna began drafting the new balance of power in Europe. Borders were to be redrawn, all dynasties restored, and equilibrium reestablished. Many believed the Napoleonic era was over. The French Empire had collapsed, its institutions dismantled, and Napoleon's name seemed destined for history. But the silence in Elba would not last. The next turning point was already on its way. The 100 Days and the Battle of Waterloo. Less than a year after his exile on Elba, Napoleon Bonaparte shocked the world with a bold return. On February 26, 1815, he set sail with around 1,000 men toward the French coast. He landed at Gulf Juan in the south and began a march toward Paris. Along the way, he faced no armed resistance. In fact, the troops sent to stop him joined him instead. The most famous moment occurred when a royal regiment blocked his path and he stepped forward alone, declaring, "If you want to kill me, here I am." The soldiers erupted in cheers. The French general had returned as Emperor of France. Upon reaching Paris on March 20th, 1815, Napoleon reclaimed power almost without bloodshed. Louis XVIII had fled, and the French people, torn between excitement and fear, accepted his return as inevitable. This period would be known as the 100 Days. Napoleon promised reforms, press freedom, and peace with neighboring countries, but the powers gathered at the Congress of Vienna refused to accept his comeback. Within weeks, the Seventh Coalition formed. Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and others committed to defeating him once and for all. War was unavoidable. The emperor knew time was short. Napoleon moved quickly. He built a new army, reorganized the government, and devised an offensive plan. He decided to strike before his enemies could unite in northern France. In June 1815, he marched to Belgium to confront British and Prussian forces. On June 16th, he defeated the Prussians at Ligny, but failed to destroy their army. 2 days later, he would face the British under the Duke of Wellington in a village called Waterloo. The battle, fought on June 18, 1815, would become one of the most famous in modern history. It was the final showdown. The fate of the French Empire would be decided there. The Battle of Waterloo began with a strong French assault, but coordination errors and unexpected resistance emerged. Rain had made the ground muddy, hampering artillery. Cavalry charges under Marshal Ney were brave but poorly timed. Meanwhile, the Prussians regrouped and arrived late in the day. Their reinforcements turned the tide. With the French army pressured on both flanks, the situation collapsed. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite unit, was defeated. Chaos followed. Napoleon, watching the disaster unfold, quietly left the battlefield. The French Empire was finished. On June 22, 1815, just 4 days after Waterloo, Napoleon abdicated for the second time. He tried to negotiate asylum in France or a neutral nation, but the British refused. He was taken into custody and handed over to British authorities. This time, exile would not be in Elba, nearby and autonomous, but in a remote, inescapable location. The Bourbons were restored again, with Louis XVIII returning to power under coalition protection. The Congress of Vienna finalized its blueprint for restoring European order. The Napoleonic era was declared over by all the great powers of Europe. The British chose to send Napoleon to St. Helena, an island in the South Atlantic, over 1,800 kilometers from the African coast. Isolated, without nearby trade routes, and under heavy surveillance, it was the perfect prison. He was transported aboard the HMS Northumberland. The former emperor departed without honors, escorted by guards and allowed to bring only a few companions. The man who had once ruled most of Europe was now a prisoner under foreign watch. The defeat at Waterloo wasn't just military, it was symbolic, final, irreversible. The name Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer a force of power, but the fate and echo of a vanished empire. The fall of Napoleon after the 100 Days was swift and brutal. In just over 3 months, he went from throne to final exile. The Battle of Waterloo became a lasting symbol at the end of an age, studied by historians, soldiers, and leaders for generations. The 100 Days proved that, even in defeat, the emperor could ignite passions and shake the world. But they also exposed the limits of his power and the strength of a now united Europe. History marched on. A new era had begun. But Napoleon's name still awaited one final destination, a lonely end, far from the palaces he once ruled.
The decline of Napoleon and the defeat in Russia. After his final defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon Bonaparte was handed over to the British, who decided to send him into a far more distant and severe exile, the island of St. Helena, located in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. Unlike Elba, which was close to Europe, St. Helena was an isolated, rocky, damp place with difficult access, ideal for preventing any escape attempts. Napoleon arrived on the island in October 1815, accompanied by a small group of loyal followers. In the eyes of Europe, he was no longer an emperor. He was now a prisoner of war. He was initially housed in temporary lodgings, but was soon transferred to Longwood House, a damp, cold, and poorly maintained residence. The climate was hostile, the isolation intense, and surveillance constant. The British governor in charge of his custody, Sir Hudson Lowe, had a tense and harsh relationship with Napoleon, imposing strict restrictions such as censorship of correspondence and limited visitation rights. Their relationship was marked by mutual distrust. Napoleon felt humiliated and wronged, and often accused the British of treating them like a common criminal. Despite the hardships, Napoleon tried to maintain a routine. He took walks, dictated his memoirs to his followers, played cards, and read books. During this period, he began, through dictation, to write his own version of the military campaigns, his rise to power, and his worldview. His goal was clear: to control the narrative of his own history and ensure that future generations would see him not as a tyrant, but as a misunderstood reformer. Through his words, he sought to reconstruct his image before history. As the years passed, his health declined. Napoleon suffered from severe stomach pains, nausea, and constant weakness. The island's doctors provided limited care, and he suspected poisoning. Modern studies point to the possibility of stomach cancer, the same cause of death as his father, although there are also hypotheses of arsenic poisoning present in the ink and wallpaper of Longwood House. Whatever the cause, his physical condition worsened day by day, draining the strength of the former emperor. Even in illness, Napoleon continued to reflect on his legacy. He harshly criticized the Bourbon Restoration, the Congress of Vienna, and the European monarchs who considered him a threat. In his view, he was a victim of a conspiracy by the old monarchies against modern ideals. He frequently recalled his victories, commented on military strategies, questioned past decisions, and compared himself to great historical figures. His mind remained sharp while his body weakened. His greatest fear was not death. It was being forgotten or remembered in a distorted way. On May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, Napoleon died on St. Helena. His last words, according to witnesses, were, "France, Army, head of the army, Josephine." He was buried on the island in a simple tomb with no name engraved, by decision of the British, who feared that Napoleon's name could rekindle revolutionary passions. However, his legend only grew. In 1840, his remains were returned to France in a grand ceremony and placed in the Dôme des Invalides in Paris. The exile had become a myth. Death silenced the man, but it immortalized the legend.
Exile, return, and the final defeat at Waterloo. The death of Napoleon Bonaparte did not mark the end of his influence. On the contrary, it initiated the creation of one of the most enduring myths in modern history. In the years following his death, a series of literary works, paintings, biographies, and political speeches began to reinterpret his life story. The defeated and exiled man was gradually transformed into an almost legendary figure, a symbol of greatness, genius, and tragedy. Napoleon became more than just historical. He became cultural, ideological, and almost mythical. In the 19th century, writers like Victor Hugo and Alfred de Vigny exalted Napoleon as a romantic hero. Artists portrayed him in grand paintings, mounted on white horses, pointing toward the future. At the same time, conservative critics saw him as a tyrant who had destroyed European order. His image began to swing between glory and tyranny, liberty and dictatorship, genius and megalomania. Napoleon was appropriated by different sides of the political spectrum. Some saw him as a defender of revolutionary ideals, others as the founder of an authoritarian empire. During the 20th century, his image continued to be explored and disputed. Authoritarian and populist regimes cited him as an example of strong leadership. At the same time, scholars began to critically examine his policies, pointing out the high human cost of his wars and the centralizing nature of his government. Debates arose over whether Napoleon had continued the French Revolution or betrayed it. Historians emphasized that although he valued merit and efficiency, he concentrated power, suppressed opposition, and crowned himself emperor. In contemporary France, Napoleon remains a controversial figure. In times of crisis, politicians invoke his name as a symbol of national strength. Museums, books, and films keep his memory alive, but not always unanimously. In 2021, the bicentennial of his death reignited debate. Some called for tributes to his legal and administrative legacy, like the Napoleonic Code. Others condemned the reestablishment of slavery in French colonies under his rule. Society remained divided between reverence and criticism. Regardless of historical judgment, Napoleon's impact is undeniable. He redrew borders, restructured legal systems, inspired armies, and terrified monarchies. His figure transcended time and influenced leaders across generations. Napoleon represents the tension between order and ambition, innovation and domination. He was a product of the French Revolution, but also a symbol of a return to imperial order. He embodied, in a unique way, the paradoxes of modern power. In the end, what remains in Napoleon are not just battles and treaties, but the eternal dispute over his memory. Was he a hero or a villain?
a liberator or a tyrant, a visionary or an opportunist? History may never give a definitive answer, because Napoleon no longer belongs only to the facts, but also to the imagination. And that, as he well knew, can be even more powerful than any army.
Napoleon Bonaparte rose from a young Corsican with military ambitions to emperor of much of Europe. His path was marked by extraordinary victories, deep reforms, and also by defeats that cost him his empire. After his final exile and death on St. Helena, Europe entered a new period of political reorganization. The map of the continent was redrawn, and many of the structures left behind by Napoleon remained influential for decades. His rise and fall reveal both the power and fragility of individual leadership amid great transformations. In the end, the name Napoleon remains one of the most recognized in history. His figure continues to be studied, debated, and remembered. This was the complete history of Napoleon Bonaparte.